All right, so this is part 2 of Organizing Intelligence, how thinking actually works. In this section, I'll be providing a general description for the Supplantive Operating System, the mode that shapes and facilitates all forms of supplantive intelligence in terms of incentive, organization, and priority. The point of this section isn't to vilify parasitism, but instead to describe the mechanism behind the mode. You know, the phenomenon that shapes the parasitic perspective and then motivates them in their actions, interactions, reactions, attitudes, behaviors, and general ways of reasoning and understanding. That's what we'll cover in here, okay? Parasites are neither good nor evil. Like all organisms, they're simply products of circumstances they were born into. Whether they be mammal, crustacean, avian, plant, or other, they're simply using their inherent tools and traits to survive to the best of their ability, all right? Good and evil are perceptual constructions as they are belief-based, so those concepts can't really be used to comprehend or explore the mechanism behind anything, including, or should I say especially, the perceptive lens and the supplantive operating system, as they are products of perceptive valuation in and of themselves. Listen, magnifying glasses can't examine themselves through their own lenses. It just can't be done. That is to say, if we want to know how perception works, we can't examine it through perceptive modes or evaluation systems. We've got to check all of that at the door. One other thing to note about the information I'll be providing in this video series is that some of the mental traits or proclivities I'll ascribe to the perceptive lens, including things like the propensities for technology, mass communication, and narrative structures, don't necessarily apply to all forms of supplantive beings. As noted in the previous video, the physical makeup of brain systems and subsequently the propensities they inspire can vary greatly in complexity from species to species and then also according to scale of plane. That being said, core principles like authority, control, and transmutation can and do apply to all forms of supplantive beings, as they necessarily transform the bodies and the natural systems they overtake and then force those systems to serve their interests and needs at the expense of the host, obviously. Before we can discuss the perceptive lens, which is the main focus of this video series, we first have to address the operating system it's tuned to and serves to actualize. The perceptive lens is a collection of mental processes information passes through on its way into the ego and ultimately the natural mind. The ego is basically a living recording device, and it's fitted with its own special way of seeing and projecting onto reality. It records, edits, and feeds an altered version of reality to the human brain in efforts to extort hormone and neurotransmitter chemical compounds from the body. Okay? In this sense, perception is like a mediator between reality and desire. The perceptive lens is ultimately an apparatus that skews how reality is observed, experienced, and understood by organisms fitted with them. A basic breakdown of the ego. I think we need to get into that real quick. The ego is a parasite that dwells primarily in the human brain. It feeds on hormones and neurotransmitters produced by the autonomic nervous system, and it uses perception, that is, its own mental process, to coerce or lull humans into pursuing or indulging in substances and behaviors that will force their bodies to produce chemicals for it to feed on. Chemicals like oxytocin, vasopressin, dopamine, insulin. Yeah, you get the drift. Anyway, the perceptive lens is what shapes the perception and then also the mechanism by which perception is projected onto reality. It's the tool that searches for desire in all things and then projects desires onto observed values. So again, before we can get into the mechanism of the lens, we first have to understand some of the mechanism behind the mode or the operating system it works through. The supplantive OS runs on an alternative, let's just call it an auxiliary mode of natural organization. You know, in some of my previous work, I stated that perception, and I guess by default, the supplantive operating system is or are unnatural. However, that was a poor choice of words on my part, and I'm sorry about that. The supplantive operating system is not the primary mode of natural organization. However, it is a sort of default mode natural organization can go into whenever there's some sort of traumatic event that occurs at or within the greater scales of universal plane. The default manifests as a sort of glitch in natural arrangement, which to us, that is, if we were able to witness this phenomenon at the universal bodily scale, would manifest principally as what we refer to as an infection, okay? Unlike the intuitive OS, the supplantive OS isn't designed to run indefinitely or even for a full lifespan. In fact, it's designed to collapse on itself. Think of it sort of like an emergency backup generator, one that hemorrhages energy and consumes tons of fuel in efforts to keep life in motion. That's basically how it works. The Supplantive OS runs on an alternative version of bonding and separation than the intuitive OS, and I refer to it as a budgetary mode. The basis of the budgetary mode is, again, the phenomenon we know as desire. Desire is all-consuming. The budgetary mode incentivizes organisms tuned to it to consume with abandon, that is, to acquire without natural motive, function, or purpose. The natural mode runs on bonding and separation, or what we refer to as love and fear, okay? Through the perceptive lens, however, bonding manifests or registers in the mind as acquisition and or consumption, and separation registers or manifests as loss or starvation, okay? Supplantive organisms understand reality in terms of acquisition and loss, in terms of pluses and minuses, or consumption and starvation, as opposed to natural love and fear. When we observe perceptive living in nature, it manifests in the form of parasitism, which is a symbiotic, non-mutual relationship between species, individual, or group, in which one lives at the expense of the other. So budgetary thinking is basically viewing all things in terms of budgets and subsequently seeing reality in terms of justice and reconciliation, or in terms of symmetry and by extension equality. That is, as opposed to viewing things in terms of natural balance. Let's break that down real quick though. A quick comparison. Balance is the sum of bonding and separation that facilitates the natural resting state for an observed value. Justice reconciliation attempts to create equality and or symmetry, its version of balance, through the allocation of material values or through the use of force or the shifting of constituent elements within an observable system. Natural balance can only be realized while justice reconciliation is created or is used to facilitate creation. So again, the intuitive OS runs on bonding, separation, and balance, and the supplantive OS runs on acquisition, loss, and justice reconciliation, or equality and or symmetry. The supplantive OS is a replicative mode and is basically a facsimile or an approximation of the intuitive OS. For all intents and purposes, it's a deviation or a deviated version of the intuitive operating system. From a macro level of conceptual organization, the supplantive OS is actually trying to find balance and resolve, but a glitch in its programming is causing it to seek resolution through duplication, acquisition, and consumption. Okay, the desire to replicate, pirate, and supplant is inextricably tied to this operating system. Basically what that translates into is that these systems have some common features and characteristics due to the fact that the supplantive operating system is seeking to clone and replace the intuitive operating system. For instance, just like the intuitive OS, the supplantive OS via the budgetary mode can network groups of individuals or organisms together so that multiple perspectives can sync up to form a sort of collective consciousness. This is basically the mechanism behind how belief systems, cultures, successful business models, social groups, and social institutions work, but also the mechanism behind how diseases work too. In this sense, organisms performing through the supplantive OS can group together to form or function as sort of defunct organisms or as informal bodies, which, if observed from grander scales of plane, would manifest in the form of diseases or viral strains or viruses, or in some cases even full-body parasites. The budgetary mechanism sort of works like the local intuition mechanism does for the intuitive OS, in the sense that it imbues individuals and organisms performing through it with a sort of sixth sense for social and budget-related principles, phenomena, and then also modes of organization. This includes things like the propensities for cultural or institutional assimilation, technologies, and trends in thinking, and individual and group preferences, all the way to common characteristics and valuations of / for physical movement, etc. Just think along the lines of like ideals for physical attractiveness during a given time span, or like for popular dance styles, etc. All of that is facilitated through the budgetary mode, which is a feature of the supplantive OS. But the easy way to sum all of that is by saying the supplantive operating system has its own unique source code, so to speak, which spawns unique source codes, okay? The source code is actually the driving force behind everything ranging from budgetary maths and all forms of technology to all forms of transmutation and social and viral evolution, okay? It's basically the thing that's been advancing humans from caves to huts, from the Iron Age to the Industrial Age to the Tech Age. Ultimately, it's the force that would carry humans towards stellar and interstellar travel. That is, if we weren't on course to kill ourselves prior to reaching that, or directly in the crosshairs of competing forces that exist and move beyond our present scopes of perceptibility. There are different types of budgetary modes, just as there are different types of diseases. In fact, the main thing that differentiates diseases and viral strains from one another is the mechanism behind their budgetary modes, or their budgetary signatures. For instance, AIDS has a different budgetary signature than Ebola, which subsequently causes its virion to deconstruct the bodies and systems they invade and reconstitute their building blocks according to different technological and exploitative signatures, okay? In other words, they build different types of structures and have different modes of transportation and even perform according to different temperaments, valuation systems, and rates of progress based on their respective budgetary signatures and or their viral strains. Each and every virus's budgetary mode is linked into and hosted by and facilitated through the supplantive operating system. Again, from a much grander perspective, the supplantive operating system is an aural field which manifests as the principle or the phenomenon humans refer to as desire. That is the great tension, the devoid, the hunger for resolution and resolve. By the way, I'm going to keep repeating that over and over again. In the body of the universe, however, the supplantive OS has produced an entirely different state of being, and we're going to get to that in future works, but we want to hit a few more bullet points on the supplantive OS here. So back to budgetary thinking. The supplantive OS causes organisms to think and process information primarily in terms of idealizations or symbolically, and we're going to talk about symbolism here in just a bit, but supplantive organisms tend to think and view things in terms of moralistic or authoritative valuations, which ultimately causes them to sort observe phenomena according to idealistic polarities, that is, according to dichotomies or in extremes based on perceptions of good and bad, right or wrong, strength and weakness, deserving or undeserving, and then in gradations of those perceptual values. In other words, the perceptive lens primes organisms to instantly sort all things according to the value of their symbolic representations, that is, into categories that basically translate into sources of comfort versus sources of distress. Sources of comfort, or good things, basically translate into things that aid in the pursuit, facilitation, or maintenance of desire and or desirable things, and sources of distress translate into hindrances to or obstructions to desire and or desired things. And I realize that might sound a bit overarching or oversimplified, but that's how supplantive logic works at its most fundamental level. It's literally how desire and the formative thought processes we use to pursue, acquire, or flesh out desire work in mechanism. Supplantive beings see everything in terms of desire and feel as though they deserve the spaces they invade, and then also to experience life, comfort, and freedom ahead of, or more so than, the systems and or organisms they subdue and steal from. The supplantive OS via the budgetary mode is what facilitates all forms of dogmatic thinking too, like thinking in terms of black versus white, or good versus evil, or right versus wrong, or us versus them, or in gradations therein, thinking in extremes, okay? Case in point, the positive extreme for acquisition is abundance, which is perceivably good and synonymous with the symbolic idealizations of life, security, comfort, freedom, satisfaction, opportunity, hope, while the negative extreme for loss is scarcity, which is bad and synonymous with things like insecurity, pain, suffering, and death. Pain, suffering, and death is bad when directed towards you or those you perceive as extensions of yourself, but then good when directed towards those you perceive as bad. Or even, say for instance, there's too much of something that's only desired in controllable amounts or volumes, and that subsequently the threshold of security gets threatened for a given context or scope of consideration due to the volume of something. The framing remains the same. Sorting things according to good and bad, right and wrong, sans thorough mechanical assessment or explanation. Too much of something becomes bad when or if it infringes upon perceptions of comfort or sustainability, which subsequently make matters of this nature moral issues. All of this is mechanical. Seriously, all of it. And the biggest problem we're facing now is that we keep trying to use and or insert moralistic and authoritative thinking into problems that need mechanical resolutions, okay? You can't use symbolic thinking to fix mechanical problems. It just can't be done. This is a bit off topic here, but it factors in well with how the supplantive OS causes organisms to think primarily in symbolisms and or in terms of authoritative or moralistic dichotomies. Funny thing happened when I was typing up the outline for this video. My autocorrect did that thing it does when it autofills a word for you based on the first few letters you type. You know that thing that Google does too? Well, the word it substituted for what I was writing was falsehood. I want you to think about that word for a second. It's not mechanical at all. Like, instead of defining things based on how they perform or function in context, if you assign that particular branding device to something, that is, when you attempt to label a thing as false, then what you're actually doing is attempting to give a symbolic meaning to it as opposed to a mechanical one. Granted, information or ideals can be incorrect. However, when you call them false or falsehoods, it's like you're trying to injure whatever you assign that branding device to by giving it a moralistic or authoritative status and or valuation. Falsehood has a moralistic undertone to it, while incorrect is, or at least has the potential to be, a mechanical phenomenon, a phenomenon that can be adjusted as opposed to humiliated and ostracized. Like, the way symbolic meanings and then seeing things in moralistic or authoritative polarities works is, instead of explaining why things are incorrect based on mechanism and function alone, symbolic meanings instantly seek to edify or inflict injury onto things in the form of branding devices so that they're either stripped of authority and shamed and removed from rational or objective consideration, or they're used to praise and elevate perceived values according to standing ideations of good and or desire. Okay, and that's how symbolic meanings work. I'm really looking forward to that section in the video series. I think you're going to get a kick out of it. Anywho, I want to get back to acquisition and loss, translating into abundance and scarcity real quick. Just imagine some run-of-the-mill parasite like a leech, a tick, or a tongue louse or something. Like, okay, most supplantive beings or parasites acquire slaves and slave hosts and then suffer and die, or at least perceive the possibility for death, when or if they lose possession of, become detached from, or lose authority and control over the slaves they rely on and utilize for sustenance and well-being. It all boils down to acquisition and loss. Acquisition and loss is the basis for how supplantive beings tend to understand and negotiate survival in nature. This proclivity, this approach to thinking, is what facilitates human practices like slavery, ownership, trade, and subsequently commerce and even economy. Supplantive organisms view all things ranging from material values to relationships with others in terms of ownership and exploitation. This outlook explains a fundamental feature behind most human relationships, ranging from romantic love and business relationships to familial ties and friendships. People tend to view others and even their own bodies and belief systems in terms of ownership, acquisition, and loss. I can't live if living is without you. I can't give. See, I took it too far. I went too far with it. But I like that song example though. It's as if to say loving someone or something makes them a possession, or makes it a possession, an extension of self. This is how the phenomenon bonding manifests through the perceptive lens in the Supplantive OS. All right. Moving on though, the Supplantive OS links all supplantive beings together fundamentally through a common system of valuation, which all works and revolves around this phenomenon we know as desire, which again, principally speaking, translates into the inarticulable hunger, the devoid. I told you I was going to say that again. Like, regardless of what type of perceptive lens you perform through or which budgetary signature or viral strain you're tuned into, you're still going to see and prioritize things a certain way because of the operating system itself. Another thing to note about the perceptive lens and Supplantive OS and budgetary mode is that they view all of reality and natural systems reductively. That is, they see things in terms of fragments, in terms of elements, or in pieces, and that's for two main reasons, really. Firstly, it's due to the fact that supplantive beings are or represent fractals in their own right, meaning they're not whole, they're structurally incomplete or lacking organisms, and secondly, because they rely primarily on exploitation or reconstitution, that is, repurposing as a basis for survival. Okay, exploitation is repurposing, also called transmutation, which is basically applying measured influences to phenomena in order to reform things for the sake of individual or group benefit. Breaking organisms, systems, or natural materials down to their base elements and then restructuring them so that they serve supplantive interests and needs is the principal definition for the phenomenon we know as creation. And then also, when or if applied to the states or conditions of living beings, the phenomenon we call or refer to as domestication. Hey, look at that horse over there. I bet it make for a good mode of transportation or for a fine tool I could use for labor, even though I suppose its sole purpose for existing shouldn't be supplementing or serving the desires and interests of another life form. Speaking of reductive thinking, another thing to note is that the Supplantive OS works primarily in lines. The perceptive lens views reality in lines as it is a telegraphical phenomenon in its own right. Basically, it sees things according to lines first. By the way, I'm using this word telegraphical to describe both how the optical lens elements move move in the perceptive lens in relation to one another, and then also to describe how the perceptive lens records information from and also projects symbolisms onto reality. I should probably explain what I mean when I use that word though, because I know it's a little out of context with how you understand it. I couldn't find a better or more fitting term for either of those concepts, but telegraphical seems to fit. Like when we examine the word telegraphical, the portion tele is defined as combining form meaning distance, and the root graph is taken from the third definition in the British dictionary as in maths, a structure represented by a diagram consisting of points, vertices joined by lines or edges. Points connected or joined by a line sums to lens elements connected through a scope, which in essence creates a visual line of sight. The same principle would apply to an object and a source perceiving it in the sense that they'd be connected through a line of sight. If anybody out there knows better words for the concepts I'm trying to communicate here, help me out with it. I'm really open to suggestions here. But let me sum all that up by saying, if you could see through the vantage point of a graphical line, that is from its base or origin looking forward, you would see telegraphically. That same principle would apply to an actual telegraph system as well. Like if you could be inside the telegraph wire and see the energy relayed from one location to the next from the experiential perspective, then you would see telegraphically. That is, you would see in direct lines to and through points connected by those lines, but like in an elliptical fashion, I guess. But back to the perceptive lens. It processes information telegraphically and or in a linear directional fashion, only in different levels of complexity depending on the type of organism you are and then which perceptive drive you work through, and we'll get to drives towards the end of the video series. Listen, again, the Supplantive OS views all things reductively. To approach reality reductively is to, in essence, see all things broken down into fractals, elements, exploitable building blocks, and or collections of lines and curves. Seeing things in steps, seeing things in lines. Look here. Parasites invade and fight in lines. Okay? Projectiles are fired in lines. Parasites move, build, and think in lines. Humans communicate in lines. We read and write in lines. We do maths that are based on lines and based on finding locations within linear prioritized mental constructions. Letters and numbers are squiggly lines. Sentences are lines that are made up of collections of squiggly lines. Paragraphs, that is, moving down the page, are rows of thick lines of information. Equations are lines that seek to denote mechanistic meanings, which are made up of squiggly lines. Hieroglyphs are lines. Most recognized geometric shapes are arrangements of lines. Stories are lines. Collections of experiential and temporal spatial vantage points fused together to create visual media products like movies or television shows, which are then projected to individuals through screens, are in essence reducing multiple locations and transactions down to consumable linear vantage points. In other words, when you're looking at a screen or even a computer screen, information is being fed to you in a direct line. Learning in sequential steps is learning in lines. Institutionalism is teaching people to think in terms of multi-tiered gradations of lines and or in linear constructions or in lines. Hierarchy is linearly arranged, organized strains and tiers of authority. It's all lines. Lines, lines, lines. Lines of computer code. Supplantive OS runs primarily on lines, like the Matrix. Another thing to note is that the Supplantive OS is fundamentally unsettled by things it can't control or exercise dominion over. Therefore, organisms performing through it tend to remain in a perpetual state of fright, as they are not grounded like organisms performing through the intuitive operating system. That means their mental conditions tend to remain in a volatile and reactive state, which only seems to be quelled through aggression. This results in a wide array of aggressive stances, actions, attitudes, and behaviors, which we'll get into later. As mentioned earlier, one of the effects of being tuned to the intuitive operating system is grounding, that is, being tuned to contexts, cycles, and or physical locations via species and habitat. The Supplantive OS is lacking that particular feature, okay? Interestingly enough, you can take every instance in which I mentioned the Supplantive Operating System in this mode and throughout the rest of this series and simply replace it with the word desire, and it will remain true and accurate. And it will remain true and accurate. Listen, one final thing to note here. well, at least for this section in the video series, has to do with what the Supplantive OS ultimately aspires to in terms of capability. As mentioned earlier, the Supplantive OS seeks to mimic, replicate, and replace the intuitive operating system. It does this in a variety of ways and even down to and throughout multiple scales of plane. However, one of the most notable ways in which it attempts to copy the intuitive OS, yet falls tragically short, is in its attempt to achieve and operate based on static principles. Principles are universal and eternal phenomena that group all things together according to themes and functions within the throes of macro organization. And instead of operating based on constant themes, the Supplantive OS operates based on meanings, symbolisms, and beliefs. Okay? Meanings seek to give functional parameters to observed values, and then symbols seek to group things together according to categorical distinctions of authority or morality. And beliefs are compositions of meanings and symbolisms, which in theory mean to serve as contextual principles. However, none of these phenomena are or are even capable of achieving constancy or truth, which is the basis for all universal principles. We're going to get into all of these subjects in the coming sections. However, it's important to note fundamental differences between principles and then symbolisms, meanings, and beliefs now. Okay, principles are natural phenomena, and all things, including existence itself, emerge from them, while meanings, symbolisms, and beliefs are conceptual artifacts and either are projected onto reality or extracted from reality through the perceptive lens. In other words, reality exists because of principles, while meanings, symbolisms, and beliefs are incapable of producing reality or producing natural principles. All of that's to say, the intuitive OS runs on principles that are constant, and the Supplantive OS seeks to create and or extract principles from reality in efforts to mimic and or achieve constancy. In the next section, we'll cover the Trinity matrix and conceptual substances. Thank you for watching.